So thank you all for coming. As you heard, I'm Andy Lowe. I work at Allstate here in our Tempe group. I'm part of our internal automation engineering group. Across the organization, we have about 600 plus devs working in a true DevOps mindset. We're working on several thousand other people that we need to get over to working that way. So I'll talk a little bit about some of what we've seen along that journey and focus a little more on kind of the soft skills side. It's a cultural talk. This is going to be the least technical one of the day probably, but a lot of what we've run into working with the business and building the culture that we have. So why do we care about culture? Because bad culture is awful and it can do all kinds of things to you. You're stuck in a rut and you're not going to try something new because, well, this is how we've always done things. Even if it's failing, we're going to keep doing it. Or all of your good people decide they want to go work somewhere else that's more fun. Or you just don't deliver on your promises. But there's not a single solution to all of this. There's a lot of different things you can focus on. DevOps is a really good one. But even so, there's no single practice that is going to solve all of that for you. But you can really take a lot of the engineering practices and apply some of that same mindset to how you think about your culture. Whether it's just doing small iterations and changing small things at once and recognizing that all of this comes together not as a single thing, but we have a lot of reinforcing principles. We wouldn't architect a product that had a single source of failure and was going to bring the world tumbling down around it. I mean, okay, we might, but it would be a bad idea. And you can take that same approach with your culture, is take a lot of different aspects and bring them all together. If you go back in time and think about how Waterfall approached things, you probably saw some graph that looked like this, that was really trying to get across the idea that as things go on in time, it costs more and more to fix problems. I spent a lot of time in aerospace and I saw this graph a lot. And it was getting across the idea that you've got to catch things early because as things move through the development process, there's a lot of handoffs that take place. The original context for why you built something the way it is was lost. You have different people that are in place. And so it just gets to be harder to fix problems. Once you actually get out to having a product in production and it's been released, that gets to be really expensive because anytime you're making changes to production, there's a lot of different aspects that you have to think about in terms of the controls you have in place, in terms of actual customer impacts. Your customers don't always like it when something's broken and they'll yell at you, but getting a fix out to them can be a really expensive thing to do. So Waterfall really had the idea that, well, we should fix things early, and they were right about that. But that was from an engineering point of view. When you started talking to the business, then you run into the question of, okay, so we built out all of these processes around designing, developing, testing, but you're not actually producing any value until it gets out into production. Your code that is sitting in GitHub is a depreciating asset, and it's not doing anyone other than the developers any good. So we started talking about things like iteration and, okay, what if I shorten my cycles and actually get something out sooner? Maybe I didn't build the entire product, but I got something out and people can start using it right away. The natural extension to that is, well, what if we do shorter cycles? Well, you get value out sooner. Maybe it's not quite as much at once, but you're getting that code out to users and you're delivering that value right away. So your business starts to buy into this. But all we did was I just took my waterfall process and did that 9 times, right? This doesn't sound good because you actually have a lot of fixed costs that go into releasing software. You have tests you want to run. There's a lot of security that you need to go through, just all your standard release processes. If you're doing a big marketing push around every release, do you really want to do that 9 times just to get that same value out there? Maybe. But a lot of these things actually are really good ideas, and there's a reason that we do them. And so you want to do those on every release. But do you have to do all of them? If all you're doing is pushing out a bug fix that for one user impacts them 1% of the time, do you have to do a marketing splash around that? Probably not. You can if you want, but you really probably don't have to. So you can start looking at, are all of these things really necessary? And that's when you start saying, okay, let's take the stuff that we really care about and automate that so it just happens for us all the time. And all of those things around testing, security scans, change management, yes, do that. It's really good, but don't actually pay someone to sit there and do it for you, because why? You can build systems to automatically do it for you, and you actually get better results from it in terms of repeatable processes. You don't have people fat fingering things. All the standard reasons that we get automation in place, we know that our releases are going to go smoothly. But one of the biggest is you actually get a really good rollback process, because the idea of pushing out software to production or pushing out your infrastructure, if you have that automated, you actually have the process of rolling back to the previous version automated as well. And usually rolling back is something that you're doing because something went badly and there's a fire drill. And rolling back is going to be at least as expensive as pushing out what you just pushed out. So if you have it automated, all those things that we were talking about earlier, they happen as part of your standard process, and you don't have to worry about, oh my gosh, I have to go around the process and do all these things in fire drill mode that really I want to do, but I want to have an exception to my security process because, oh crap, production's down. Well, if you have all of this automated, it just happens for you. And so your rollbacks actually get to be a lot smoother as well. Where that really pays off is on the automated testing side. If you've built out all of these iterations and I want to release at, say, iteration 8, I actually have to test everything that came out beforehand. Regression testing is a good thing because you never know when you caught a bug or when you introduced a bug. But really the only way you're going to do that is if you have full automation, because otherwise, by definition, your QA cycle that took 1 week to test 1 iteration's worth of things, if you're now testing 2 iterations, you have 2 weeks worth of QA to do, 3 weeks. This kind of exponentially adds to your release cycle unless you have all of this automated. So you almost are forced into taking this approach if you want to be delivering quickly. And if your business asks you, why are you out spending time on test automation? Well, do you want to test everything and still be able to keep up your release cadences? Well, that's why you're investing in test automation, is to make sure you can do all that. Going back to the waterfall slide, the waterfall solution to this was at each one of these handoff points, we would have a meeting, we get all the different groups together, talk about, okay, we just designed this thing, let's tell you what it is you're gonna go develop, and then we just built this thing, let's tell you what it is you're gonna go test, and by the time you're out in production, it's just going insane with all the different people that have to be involved in this process. And it doesn't really scale very well. If I'm actually in this model of we have all these iterations that are happening, and I want to do a meeting at each one of these things, I'm going to be spending all of my time in meetings. And you can see that, where am I actually spending my time? Is it on development? Is it on test? Is it in meetings? Well, it's going to be in meetings. So that's where the common concept of team ownership that gets to be really big in DevOps comes into play. Is, let's think about, do we need a dedicated team to manage this part of the process, a dedicated team for this part of the process, a dedicated team for this? Or can we actually have an entire group that owns the full product all the way through that? And what you end up getting is some of those barriers are broken down between the initial design stage and the development stage and the test stage. People have context throughout the entire life cycle of the product, and you don't have that same incentive to, I'm gonna pass it off to the next group. It's their problem to deal with it, because you actually own whatever that is that you're building. And if you pass it off to the next guy, well, that's actually you. And so it's your problem to deal with at that stage. So once you get into that full life cycle ownership, then you actually get through a lot of these things faster because that cost of handoffs goes way down. and you don't have to deal nearly as much with all the process involved with that. This only works though if your senior leadership is willing to empower you to do this. If they're going to get in and say, at each one of these stages, you have to have my formal approval to move on to the next stage, that's gonna kill whatever you're trying to do. So you really have to get the leadership buy-in to empower the teams and be able to say, you guys own this. I trust you to do the right thing, and you guys are gonna do the right thing, and if not, it's on you to fix it. I'll be there to help you through, but I'm empowering you to go out and build this the right way, and let's cut down on some of these silos. One of the really cool things that you can get into at that stage is, when are we actually releasing to prod? In the old days, we would do releases, Saturday nights at midnight? That doesn't sound like fun. And what that's implicitly saying is, I don't really trust that this is going to go well. So I'm going to do it when no one's using the system, and I'm going to give myself the entire weekend to go out and fix it because it didn't go well. That doesn't really work. And if you start iterating quite a bit, then you end up in this stage of, well, there's 52 weeks in the year. So if I'm doing releases only on the weekend, I just cap myself at 52 releases a year. I have teams across our DevOps space, about 100 teams are releasing an average of 2.5 times a week. There are literally not that many weekends in a week to make that possible. So to be at that space, you have to be able to release during the week. But to put that trust in a team, they have to understand what the impacts to users are going to be. If you don't understand all the way through that if I push to prod and it doesn't go well, my users are going to be picking up the phone and screaming at me, well, that's fine, but you're not going to have the systems in place to actually make sure it goes well. So once you get to this stage of I'm able to push to prod all the time, that's saying the team has systems in place to make sure that this is actually going to work. We know what's going to happen to our users if it doesn't work, and we don't want that to happen. So we're going to make sure that it does in fact work. And leadership has to be able to say, okay, you guys understand this. You know what's going to happen if it goes badly. I trust you to make the right decision on this. And that suddenly frees up your team to do things like deploy during the week and not be spending their weekends on the phone coordinating with each other as they're trying to do releases. But you implicitly have the trust that it's going to work. Now, don't get me wrong, there may be times when for various reasons you actually want to release on the weekends, but figure out why you're doing that and try to minimize those times, because it's no fun for anybody, and all you're actually saying is, we don't think this is going to go well. But if you know that you have the systems in place to make sure that it does go well, release during the week, people are going to be around, they're going to be awake, and if something does go badly, you know those automated rollbacks that you had already? That saves you. One of the other interesting things that you run into is if you're kicking off a project, you don't actually know if it's going to work. You can put together a business plan that says, I'm going to build out this thing, and it's going to be the next iPod. But if your assumptions are wrong, maybe it's actually the next Zune. And you can build out these spreadsheets that, well, if your adoption rate is off by 1%, suddenly you just lost $1 million. And it's really easy to build out those spreadsheets. I've done it. So for purposes of putting together a slide, I can put together something that shows nice linear value always increasing, and we're always building value for the company. But the reality is, I don't actually know. I can make projections, but until I actually start building things, I don't know what's going to work. And within these iterations, I can start saying, well, okay, we've narrowed our uncertainty window. And oh, that one didn't really go as well, so maybe our expected value is a little bit higher. But as you go, you start being able to predict a little more how much value you're actually going to deliver until you're actually through your project and you can say, this is what we actually did. So the concept of experiments have come up in several of the talks earlier today. And it's a concept that I think the people in this room will get, but if you go out and talk to your business and say, yeah, we're gonna run an experiment to do this thing, they're going to look at you and say you're crazy, because they have this concept of experiments are just these mad scientists off trying something and they don't know what they're doing. That's not what an experiment is. An experiment really is a much more controlled thing where you have a hypothesis that you're trying to test. You have metrics. You know what it is that you're trying to do and there's structure around it. It's not, I'm going to go build this thing and maybe it'll work, check back in a week. But you actually know what it is you're trying, and you have metrics that say what it is you're doing. So do I know that my failures are going to go down if I put in retry logic? No, but I can tell you what metrics I'm looking for. I can tell you what my exact approach is going to be, and I can look at metrics like that. Do I know that if I make my button blink that more people are going to click it? Well, if you've been around the web for a while, you actually know that's not going to work. But you can run those kinds of experiments and say, this is the metric that I'm trying to influence. This is what I'm going to do. This is what I think is going to happen as a result of it. And that's actually a much more palatable approach when you're talking to the business, because they get that. But inherent in this is the idea that you have all this structure in place. Each one of those iterations actually was an experiment. We didn't know for sure the value that we were going to deliver. We had a hypothesis, and we could say, I think I'm going to influence metrics by this much, but until you actually run one of these, you don't know for sure what you're doing. So once you start thinking about things as an experiment and making sure everyone has shared context on what that actually means, then you start getting the freedom to say, I'm going to run an experiment to do this thing I read about online or heard about at DevOpsDays, and it sounded like a great idea. This is exactly what I'm going to do. These are the metrics I think I'm going to influence, and in a short iteration, I'm going to be able to tell you whether or not it worked. And if it didn't, you try something new. If it did, awesome. So you have the metrics in place as part of the idea, I'm running an experiment. And that sets up everybody for the idea that maybe it's going to work. Okay, we'll be accepting of the fact that maybe this is going to fail, and that's why we're doing it as a short experiment, but we don't actually know. Maybe it's going to be absolutely amazing and awesome, and much though I have my projections, until we try it out, we don't know for sure. One of the other keys is, if you're running an experiment, you have to learn from it. You don't just say, we did this thing and it changed metrics. You actually have to go back and say, what happened? Why did it do this? What learnings can we take from this and incorporate into our product going forward? And that's a key part of the experiment approach as well, is it's not just that, okay, we did something, it's we did something, what do we learn, how do we apply that? You also get into the idea of, it gets very quick to try things because you're in very short cycles. If something doesn't work, the cost of doing that is fairly low. And so you get a lot of that freedom to try out something, see if it works, see if it doesn't work, and see where it goes from there. But as I mentioned, you really have to have that structure in terms of how you have the conversations, in terms of how you run your organization, your teams, and how you talk with business, to be able to say, this is what we're going to try, this is what we think it's going to influence, this is why, and at the end of it, we're going to be able to come back and tell you, did this work or not? One of the big things that Waterfall was really trying to do with a lot of the structures that they had is try to keep your costs down by putting checkpoints in place before you would really get to these expensive stages. But a lot of what DevOps is about is saying, let's take some of these things that are expensive and do them first. One of the big concepts that's come out is TDD, and let's take all this expensive testing and actually get a test framework in place before we write the code. If I know what it is I'm trying to test, and I have very set acceptance criteria that say, this is what it looks like when it works, then suddenly all of that cost around doing testing and all those handoffs, that gets to be a lot lower, because going into the development phase, I know whether or not something's going to work. And even taking the idea of what does it look like at the release side, if I build out a small MVP, maybe I didn't actually take the entire cost of spinning up a business unit to launch some new thing. All I did was build out a sign-up form and say, are you interested in this thing that I put together some marketing sheets around? And that'll tell me whether or not it actually worked. So a lot of these concepts around lean and building out MVPs really feed into let's keep our costs down so that we can go faster. One of the other interesting things that you run into is as you're going through these small iterations, it doesn't always feel like you did a lot. If I go through a 9-month cycle and released everything all at once, wow, I just released 9 months of work all at once. It's new, it's amazing, it's exciting. But on a weekly basis, you don't always feel some of that change. And so you have to take the time to celebrate with your teams and say, hey, guys, remember what it was like 9 months ago when we started on all these iterations? Think about all the difference that you've made since then. And you also have to be able to go back to the business and say that, because if you are really good at DevOps, you're not changing things a lot all the time. You're making a set of small changes. And so it's really easy for them to say, yeah, those DevOps guys, they're just overdoing something and we're not seeing a lot of change. And so you have to go back and remind them of what it was like 9 months ago or whatever interval and be able to say, yeah, look at all the change that we delivered along the way. Look at the learnings that we had. Look at all the risk that we avoided by finding out early that these ideas weren't going to work and pivoting over to other things. And that's an important conversation to be able to have as you go through this. So we took our Legos and we put them together into this really cool rocket ship or Mars rover, whatever this thing is. And you take all these pieces and all of them fit together to build up a really strong DevOps culture. But they're not like by themselves, not a single one of them is going to be the answer. And if you go back and talk to some of my team, they'll say, yeah, that's great that you're talking about this, but we don't always do these things really well. That's why we do all of them. I can take out one of these pieces and the entire structure isn't going to fall down. I could take out a couple of them and it's not going to fall down. You know, we'll have somebody that just had a bad day writing tests and we have things in place later to catch that something went wrong with the tests and we missed something. Or we forgot to really do a good job creating our metrics. And so, well, we went through a week and didn't actually look at our metrics, but it's not the end of the world because now we can go back and take the next week and say, what did we learn? So you've got to put all these things together in a cohesive picture and recognize that not a single one of them is going to work. That's not an idea that's unique to developing software or business. And it's something that you'll see an analog to that all over the world. This is a picture I took when I was out hiking once. And to get down here, you had to walk down this, well, first you had to climb over a gate that was locked. And then you had to walk down a dirt road that was over the hill, over a lake, and was kind of crumbling, and there were cactuses and whatnot. And then you got down here, and, well, we see we have this unmaintained road, which is kind of a clue that maybe you shouldn't keep going, especially not if you're driving. And we have things like boulders that are here, again, a clue that, well, maybe you shouldn't keep going, and we have bushes blocking it. And by the way, someone decided to put out a sign here saying, this is a dead end, don't go this way. And there was a reason for all that, because there's a cliff right back there. And if you go over the cliff, you're probably gonna die. And if you don't die, you're in a lake, and so you better hope you can swim, because you're actually in a lake right next to a dam, right by the intake valves, and you're gonna get sucked under, and then you're gonna die. This is bad. But someone left a gap there, so they're not actually stopping you. You can go right through here. This is empowerment. This is saying, maybe there actually is a reason we should let people do this. Because maybe there's a team that flies drones out of here that is using this access area to inspect the dam. And so yeah, we want a lot of clues here that they shouldn't be going down here. People like me that were down there for no good reason. There's some clues that maybe we shouldn't be going this way. But maybe you actually do have a reason for what you're doing. And so you want to keep going down this path. And those same concepts apply to a lot of the culture that we're trying to build and that really fit into DevOps, is you've got a bunch of guardrails in place that say, this is the path you should follow. There's a lot of safety rails you want in place. But if you're not going to, I'm gonna trust you to make a good decision here because you own this, right? And so, well, yeah, I'm gonna be supportive and help you out if you get yourself into trouble. But on the other hand, you're a smart person and you can see that cliff. So be really careful about what you're doing. So how do you get started with this kind of culture? I've talked about a lot of different things. Pick one, start. I'm a deployment guy, so I would be all about the automated deployments and get to the point that you can do midweek deploys fully automated and everything goes fine. That's a great goal. But you guys know your organizations. I don't. I'm a guy at a conference. I don't know you. Pick what works for you and where your culture is and do something that moves the needle forward. Because really that's what this should all be about, is let's take small iterations that make a difference somehow, somewhere, and build on that as we go. And take all these concepts and put them together, but move the needle somehow. And that's really what DevOps should be about. Cool. Thank you for coming and listening. And any questions? Cool. Thank you all.